And now I want to talk through how to actually create a curriculum map. So I am going to talk through first verbally, kind of quickly here, a couple of parts of a curriculum map. So the first part of a curriculum map is the set of outcomes, or sometimes these are called goals or standards, but most usually they are actually student learning outcomes or program outcomes or institutional outcomes. So we first start with our set of outcomes in which we are wanting to demonstrate alignment. We then are thinking about the courses, the activities, the assessments, or the actions that make up the curriculum for that program or course. We want to always make a legend, which is then going to identify for us the levels of which the program or course offers or addresses a particular outcome. So again, that's that desired degree of learning piece. So 3 pieces. First, the outcomes. Second, the activities. And third, the legend that kind of tells the story of our curriculum map. Now, faculty members typically begin with the program's intended student learning outcomes. This is the recommended and the required, so both sets of outcomes. This is also going to include any type of, core learning outcomes that y'all might have. And then we also want to think about any other kind of required events or experiences. These are things like potentially certificate exams or internships or advising sessions, any other experience. And then we'd want to create a form in the map of a table. So I'm going to take a second and I am going to go ahead and show a couple of the examples of the curriculum maps. So I'm going to pause on each one so you can take a second to kind of digest them. So here you can see on our left-hand side, we have our courses. Along the top are our program objectives. Our key, the I is standing for introduced, the P is standing for practiced, and the D is standing for demonstrated. So just looking at this, I want you to think in your own head or talk out loud. What are you noticing by looking at this curriculum alignment matrix? Things I'm noticing, and I hope you are too, is that right now, none of these courses are addressing program objective 4. I'm also noticing that for program objective 2 and program objective 5, we have little saturation in that each one is only addressed by one of the courses within the program. Whereas program objective 6, we are seeing that it is addressed by a lot of the courses within the program. And that may not be a bad thing. Program objective 6 may be, one of while they are all key outcomes or objectives for the program objective 6 may be the one that is, most tightly aligned to one of the institutional outcomes, for example. Let's take a look at another example. So again, we're looking at course objectives down the side, program objectives along the top. And we can see that we have basic, intermediate, and advanced as our different degrees of learning. So I'm noticing a couple of things. First, program objective 4 and program objective 5 are not addressed by this course. And again, that might be okay. Let's look at the map. So we have the outcomes are basic and intermediate. So not every course, again, has to address every program outcome, but this is a view of one course. And so this might be okay that it's not touching on program objective 4 and 5. I'm going to go back one. You'll notice that on the left-hand side, this is multiple different courses. So this is 9 different courses, so maybe all of the courses within a program. So the fact that there's not a lot of saturation in program objective 2 or program objective 5, that could be a problem. And that there's none for program objective 4, that is definitely a problem. So again, in our current example, we are looking at one specific course and how it is aligned to the program. This could be an introductory course, which is why we are only looking at degree of learnings that are basic and intermediate. It also may be why program objective 4 and 5 are not being addressed on this course. These might be higher levels of learning. What I would say is that for course objective 6 and course objective 7, they should probably be aligned in some way to our program objectives or our program outcomes that have been deemed important. Now again, different programs are set up differently, so that does not always apply, but in most cases I believe it does. We are now going to move on to our curriculum mapping activity. So that was just a warm-up. Earlier in the session today, I indicated that there was a handout. So under handouts of your GoToWebinar, there is a Word document called Hometown University Curriculum Mapping Example. I want you to go ahead and download that. If you're not able to get it from the handout section, I did also email it to everyone a couple minutes before the session started today. So if you're able to, I'd like you to pull up that document. I'll give you all a second to go ahead and get it open. And I'm going to open it on my screen as well. So you'll notice that once you're able to get it open, you are going to notice that it is a curriculum mapping example for an institution called Hometown University. This is a fictitious example of a campus that we use quite often at Campus Labs. Now, included in this document is essentially why Hometown University would like to participate in curriculum alignment. It includes the institutional learning outcomes. It includes program and course learning outcomes for the business program. So I want us all to take a second and read through the first page. So this is the curriculum mapping example information and the ILOs, which were based around the NACE outcomes, which are the National Association of Colleges and Employers. So everyone take a second and read through those institutional learning outcomes. Once you have an opportunity to read through the institutional learning outcomes, I want you to scroll down on your Word document and read through the program learning outcomes, so the business program outcomes. There's 4 of them. And this is the beginning of page 2. Okay, once you've read through both the institutional outcomes and the program outcomes, I want you to take a second and look at the first curriculum map example. Here, we're going to be looking on the y-axis of the program, the business program outcomes, so program learning outcome 1 through 4. And you can feel free to, it is a Word document, so if you all want to type right in or do any kind of organizing that you need to, feel free. Along the other axis, we're seeing the institutional learning outcomes. Now, for ease of kind of collaborating in this new remote life that we find ourselves, I did kind of shorten the ILOs for you here. You probably will need to go back and read some of them in order to align the program outcomes effectively. What I want you to do now is take a second and put an X to indicate where a program learning outcome addresses an institutional learning outcome. I will tell you that I have aligned it in such a way that each program learning outcome addresses one of the institutional learning outcomes. So in your document, you can go ahead and type, or if you want to write, that's perfectly fine. You can identify, go ahead and put the X to indicate where a program learning outcome addresses an institutional outcome. All right, if you look back, I know you probably have, Word document open, but when you're ready, I want you to click back and identify for me which hometown university ILO is not addressed by the business program's outcomes. And please take your time. All right, I'm going to close the poll out. And if you didn't get a chance to vote, that's okay. There has been it's really interesting to watch these polls and kind of see where they come in at. Now, this is always an area for conversation. When I am reading through the institutional learning outcomes and the program outcomes, I have identified that institutional learning outcome for digital technology is not addressed by any of the 4 business program outcomes. Now, some of you have identified alternate institutional learning outcomes that you all feel are not addressed by the programs. This is where curriculum mapping becomes really essential to be a part of a conversation amongst different individuals. Now, when I'm looking through these, I have pulled out, when I'm reading through the business program outcomes, I took time and kind of compared them independently to each one of the institutional outcomes. That was how I determined that institutional learning outcome 4, digital technology, was not really addressed by any of the 4 business program outcomes. Now, again, it's not always a bad thing to have a disagreement or to see things differently. That creates the opportunity for conversation. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. So on your document, I now want you to read through the business course outcomes. So there's 2 course examples here, Business 101 and Business 201. Once you've had a chance to read through the course outcomes, I want you to use the next curriculum map example, and I want you to align each one of the course outcomes to one of the program outcomes. For the ease of example, I have put on here the shorthand for what I believe are the different program outcomes. Okay, once you all are ready and take your time, I want you to identify for me which business PLO is not addressed by any of the course outcomes. And take your time. I know that kind of reading back and forth between the program outcomes and the course outcomes can be a little bit difficult. All right, just looking at time now, I'm going to go ahead and close out this poll. So if you're still working on yours, feel free to finish up. You can feel free to save any of those materials that I've shared. When I designed this, I left out specifically program learning outcome 2, diversity, and about 69% of you agreed program learning outcome 2, diversity, was not represented by any of the Business 101 or Business 201 courses. Again, for those of you that saw potentially that diversity was represented, that creates, again, a point of conversation between us as hypothetical colleagues to discuss where we thought that each one of these areas was or was not represented. I want to thank you all for participating in that activity. It always becomes a little bit different or, difficult here when we, intend to be on site on campus and we kind of transition to, being remote. So I appreciate you all kind of participating in that with me. All right, now I am going to kind of get us back into a little bit of the overall session. So again, thanks for participating in the activity. I think it went relatively well. It's a little bit hard again doing some of this remote, so I appreciate your kind of patience and your participation. I know you all, it takes a little bit of time to read everything and consume everything, and it's a little bit weird when we're online and remote. So again, appreciate your participation, and I hope you found it, worthwhile to participate in. So moving us along, we have, about 15 minutes left. I want us to think about what is the next item to consider when creating a curriculum map. So the ones that we just created together were pretty basic. We essentially just identified which outcomes were being addressed in what specific areas. So which institutional outcomes were being addressed by programs, and then which course outcomes were being addressed by, or which program outcomes were being addressed by the courses. So take a second and just think about, what would be, two of the next things. I said one, but now I'm going to say two. What are two of the next items to consider when creating a curriculum map? The first one that I would say would be our desired degree of learning, which we've already kind of chatted about earlier today. And the next one that we'd want to look at is definitely aligning assessments. So assessment mapping is really similar to curriculum mapping. It's kind of like curriculum mapping turned on its side. It requires that you're looking at the program in its entirety and somewhat, holistically. Rather than focusing on the instruction of specific concepts, assessment mapping is all about where those concepts are assessed and how. So this is a real emphasis on where and how often students are assessed on student learning outcomes. So faculty can really learn much about the students as well as the courses and program itself by analyzing the data collected as a result of some type of ongoing assessment, whatever it may be. And this can actually help us to identify where learning is happening. So there is, of course, a nuance to aligning assessments, right? We need to be prepared to do so. So the first thing that I always think about when preparing faculty to participate in an assessment mapping activity, we want to make sure that everyone is familiar with the process of curriculum mapping or curriculum alignment, and they are often coming together to talk about their teaching. So assessment mapping isn't really, or excuse me, yes, assessment mapping is not really different, but you might find that there are potentially faculty members who are, not aware of the or are unfamiliar with the process and who might need a little bit more preparation when you sit down to do assessment mapping. So I say the first thing that you always want to make sure is people are prepared, right? So you want to first create an initial assessment, an initial curriculum map in order to kind of start off. Now, these things, they don't take 20 minutes. They take some time and they take some conversations. But I would always say whenever engaging with others, I would just make sure you're all on the same page. I would talk through how you're defining a curriculum map, talk through the curriculum map that potentially has already been designed, and then really think through what assessments are happening in which courses. So always make sure you're kind of setting goals for those sessions to make sure that you're making progress. And again, this is not something that happens in, one hour meeting. It's usually, you work through the curriculum mapping activity, and you might even do that on your own and come back together to have a conversation about it. And then you move on to adding in the desired degree of learning. And then you move on to adding in and aligning those assessments. So I want to take a look at a couple of examples of assessment map curriculum crosswalks. So this is one example. I'll give you a second to kind of just read it over and digest it. So this is really thinking about aligning. We always think about aligning outcomes first. So we've already done that in this case. Then our conversation flips into the direction of how to identify key assessments. We don't need to over-assess or build every assessment that we possibly have in. We just want to think about having conversations about where to start to align some of these items. So we want to select, the real core of our assignments and our assessments, and really think about developing action-based criterion based on performance level language. And then we can go through and identify key assessments and assignments and ensure that they are mapped across the curriculum like this example shows us. Now, here is another example. This example is showing us and if you take a second to kind of consume it, it's showing us blocks of student learning outcomes that are organized by overarching outcomes. So content has kind of 3 outcomes underneath it. Critical thinking has student learning outcome 4 and 5. And then along the top, we can see it has our identification of research methods, advanced content course, and within the middle, it identifies for us what exactly the assignment or the assessment is going to be within the curriculum. So again, these things take time to develop. They do not happen, overnight or independently of your colleagues. I want to talk a little bit now about preparing for assessment mapping. So now that we're more familiar with the process of curriculum alignment and the tool of curriculum mapping, we may start to think about and considering getting together with our colleagues to talk about teaching, to talk about our teaching, their teaching, how our outcomes are being measured, how their outcomes are being measured across our joint program. There are 5 questions that can help you to promote an intentional mapping effort. They're organized by purpose, scope, participation, form, and limitations. So the purpose, what are we mapping and why? And what pieces of the educational environment need to be aligned? The scope, what parts of the learning environment are included or left out by this approach? So what are those gaps? Participation, who we want to be involved in the conversations, and are they, making sure that those participants are up to date on what we are undertaking and what the goals of this purpose, of this mission are. Form, how many layers do our maps need to address educational complexity? And then limitation, so what ways of seeing are we excluding in our maps? Mapping across the learning environment is productive because when done collectively, we are able to identify our alignments and make changes and modifications. Now, a couple of best practices in alignment in order to wrap up our session today. So first, we want to think about focusing on highly valued outcomes. So we want to think about eliminating, I know, right? Scary word, eliminating outcomes that are not highly valued and then focusing on the highly valued outcomes by including them in multiple courses. Now, this doesn't mean that the eliminated outcomes can't still be, some course level outcomes depending on your program. They don't have to disappear completely from the curriculum, but maybe they are more appropriate at a course as opposed to a program. And then you also want to think about asking if the department or program is trying to do too much. Do you have like 15 program learning outcomes? If yes, that might be too much, or they might be, how we talked about earlier, they are a little bit too specific instead of being more broad and allowing the course outcomes to be more specific. Set priorities as a program or a department, and when everyone is truly actively engaged and working together toward, a common outcome, this can really help to increase the likelihood that students are going to be able to actually achieve the learning outcome that is set forth for them. Now, with that being said, collaboration within your program is key, but that does not mean that you have to lose your autonomy as a faculty member. We talked a little bit about this earlier in that, you should still think about your strengths. And actually, by doing this, by not making every single section of a course identical, programs are actually stronger, especially if students are then advised for which specific section maybe meets their needs such as, mode of instruction or structure of the course or whatever it may be. Communicate. So this last piece, so this is coming back way back to the beginning of the session, an hour and 20 minutes ago when we talked about NILOA and the transparency framework of NILOA. So think about publishing not only your learning outcomes, but even your curriculum map and distributing it to students, to faculty, especially those within your program. And you could even work to remind students what they were introduced to, what outcomes they have potentially already addressed in other courses, especially if it's a sequence, right? So if we're in a 300 level course, revisiting the 100 level and 200 level course outcomes is maybe not a bad thing. You can explain how the current course kind of fits within the broader scope of the alignment, and we really should definitely not expect students to be able to make those types of connections on their own. That's where we, or you all as faculty members, can kind of step in and help them to become more within a growth and reflective mindset. So thank you all for joining me today. I have just my references up on the screen for you here. You can see I did a lot of kind of research in order to put this together for you all today. And then I have a couple of sample curriculum mapping tools and development resources that I used, and also that you all will be able to, have access to with these links once I send out the PDF of our session for today. I'm happy to take any questions. I know we have about 6 minutes, but happy to kind of stay on the line and see if anybody has any questions.